Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The Missing Body and Remains of Anne Boleyn. Following the execution of Anne Boleyn, many rumours regarding the deceased Queen of England emerged across the country. Some people celebrated Anne's death, as she was disliked by large amounts of the English population, seen as a woman who stole the heart of the King of England, Henry VIII, with the victim in the saga being his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Anne's relationship and marriage with the king divided England, as Henry, to get his wish, an annulment from his first marriage, split from Rome and the Pope. He then declared himself the supreme head of the church and forced his subjects to accept him as the head of the church of his country, which many people could not. Even some of his close friends, such as Thomas More, could not accept this and refused to support Anne Boleyn as the queen. But following Anne's sharp fall from grace, which resulted in her execution, there were many rumours that emerged about her, especially with regards to her remains and final resting place. During the Victorian times, large-scale renovation works were ordered by Queen Victoria inside the chapel of St Peter ad Vincula at the Tower of London. Buried underneath the floor and inside the crypt were the remains of around 1,500 people, and many of them, it's alleged, were identified, including the remains of Anne Boleyn. Forensic investigation took place of these remains, and they described that the remains of Anne had a small neck and noted how the head was separated from the body. But there was a legend that emerged inside of Norfolk, a county in England that had links to Anne, that following her death, her body was removed from the Tower of London and was reburied beneath a plain black marble tombstone in Saul Church near to Bickling Hall. This rumour would challenge the traditional burial site of Anne Boleyn. In this video, we're not going to try and change history and prove otherwise, that Anne was not buried under the floor of the chapel inside of the Tower of London, but instead delve into the legend that Anne is buried in Norfolk and not the Tower. It is of course your own belief and decision as to what you believe on this story, and it is very much unlikely too that there will ever be final confirmation of Anne Boleyn's resting place using DNA, as it's practically impossible that the Crown will grant permission for an excavation of her remains under the Tower's chapel floor, and also inside Saul Church. They will not allow an excavation either. Because of this, rumours and legends persist and live on. But what is the story of Anne Boleyn possibly being buried at Saul Church? As mentioned, it's up to you to what you believe in, but let's consider some of the evidence on this. In a book written in 1858 by B.B. Whiffin, titled Notes and Queries, it touched upon the rumour saying, "It is said that, in Mrs. Strickland's Queens of England, that there is a tradition in Saul in Norfolk, that the remains of Anne Boleyn were removed from the Tower and interred at midnight, with the rites of a Christian burial in Saul Church, and that a plain black stone without any inscription is supposed to indicate the place where she is buried." Sharon Turner, in History of the Reign of King Henry VIII, cites a passage from Crispin's account of Anne Boleyn's execution, written 14 days after her death, which says, "Her ladies immediately took her head and the body. They seemed without souls, they were so languid and extremely weak, but fearing that their mistress might be handled unworthily by inhumane men, they forced themselves to do this duty, and though almost dead, at last carried off her dead body wrapped in a white covering." Crispin, who was a foreign dignitary in London at the time of Anne's execution, has been classed as a reliable witness who had no tie to the government of the king at the time the sword fell, taking Anne's head off. But this does not definitively say what happened to Anne's body, and Crispin's account does not offer that she was buried immediately inside the Tower's chapel, which leaves the possibility of Anne's body being transported out of her place of execution. Historian Agnes Strickland in 1842 also commented on the rumour, saying, "In Anne Boleyn's native country, Norfolk, a curious tradition has been handed down from father to son for upwards of 3 centuries, which affirms that her remains were secretly removed from the Tower's church under the cover of darkness and privately conveyed to Saul Church, the ancient burial place of the Boleyns, and that the body was interred at midnight, with the holy rites that were denied to her by her royal husband at her first unhallowed funeral. There is some truth to this account, as the church, which is regarded as huge for the size of the village where today only 50 people live, was owned by the Boleyn family. They were the lords of the manor and owned the land. So is there some truth in this? Charles Dickens, writing in 1848, inside of Bentley's Miscellany, even touched upon the rumour, saying, Anne Boleyn has apprehended that her remains would be indignantly treated, that the rites of sepulture would be withheld from her, and that her grave would be where no memorial would be found of her, and therefore her appeal to Wyatt to save her, if possible, to the tomb of her fathers. Her desire had now, however, a prospect of fulfilment. A grave had been opened in Saul Church, which was the ancient burial place of her father's family, and thither on the second night after Wyatt's arrival, the Earl proceeded, accompanied by his guests, ostensibly for the purpose of having midnight masses, said for the repose of his daughter's soul. His daughter's remains, however, went with him. They had, under Mary Wyatt's care, immediately upon their removal from the Tower to her house, been most carefully embalmed and wrapped in mere cloth. In that state, and covered with a black velvet pall, she was placed in one of her father's carriages, into which Wyatt and his sister entered, the Earl preceding them, in another carriage alone. What the Earl's thoughts and reflections were during the 2 hours he was slowly and unabsolvedly travelling by Alsham and Corston to Seoul, it would not be difficult to divine. He had within a month lost a daughter and son by the hand of the execution. That son, his only son, that daughter, the Queen of England. Her name beside had been branded with infamy, and the prime mover of all this misery to him, the most active agent to work him all of this ill, to bring his son and daughter to the block, was his own son's wife, the infamous Lady Rochford. There ended all his dreams and ambitions, all his influence and prosperity. His children beheaded, his name dishonoured, himself shunned. He was now alone, in might he said, in the world. One daughter yet remained to him, his daughter Mary, but she had 2 years before incurred the anger of her father by marrying Sir W. Stafford, and he was utterly estranged from her. The bitter reflections of those 2 hours perhaps the better prepared the Earl for the solemn ceremonies that awaited his coming at Saul Church. He alighted there at midnight. A few faithful servants bore the mangled remains of his daughter to the side of her tomb, but the perilous duty all there were arranged in would not allow a numerous tapes of chapel ornate, of a whole choir of priests, or grand ceremonials. One priest was there, and the few candles that were lighted did no more than just show the gloom in which they were shrouded. But all that could be done for the murdered queen was done. Mass was said for the repose of her soul. Her remains were carefully lowered into the grave, where they now rest, and a black marble slab without inscription or initials alone mark it the spot which contains all that was mortal of Anne Boleyn, once Queen of England. The problem with Dickens's account is that this is entirely a fictitious account of the removal of Anne Boleyn's body, claiming that her father had her body removed to have it interred within the walls of a church he saw more befitting on his own land. Although this would have been a plausible in some regards, Henry VIII would never have allowed the remains of his shamed wife to be moved out of the Tower of London. He went to great lengths to ensure Anne's influence and image around England were removed, even chipping her initials and motifs off of the ceiling in Hampton Court. He would have needed to control where the remains of Anne Boleyn were, as they could have been used against him by rebels, or she could have been venerated as a martyr against the king. Also, her father lost all his power following her execution, and despite not being the most powerful player at court, it's doubtful that he could have ordered the secret exhumation of his daughter's remains from somewhere as heavily guarded as the Tower of London. But more accounts of the links between Anne Boleyn and Saul Church continued. Francis Lancelot in 1858, in his book The Queens of England, wrote, the remains of the unfortunate Anne Boleyn, covered with a sheet, were placed by her maids in an elm chest, and immediately afterwards buried by the side of her fellow victims in the chapel of the Tower, without singing or prayer, but her friends returned at midnight and disinterred them, and conveyed them away in secret, buried them in Saul Church in Norfolk. Lancelot does not reveal his sources and does not name any of those friends who it's believed could have done this. It is believed that Thomas Wyatt could have been involved in the plot that Lancelot talks about to remove her remains from the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, but there isn't any concrete evidence linking Wyatt to a plot of this type. Wyatt himself was arrested in the May of 1536 and was held at the Tower, and he would not have been able to plot the removal of Anne's remains from his prison cell. But what is interesting is that the security at the Tower of London was not as amazing as it could have been during the Tudor period. For example, Alice Tankerville, a woman held inside the Tower, managed to coerce her jailer to help her escape, and despite being caught by night watchmen outside the Tower's walls, they did manage to escape. But surely unearthing remains in the middle of the night would be too much and too noisy to do. Wyatt did comment on Anne's burial, saying, "God provided her corpse sacred burial, even in a place as it were consecrated to innocent." With this it's considered that he could have been referring to the Tower of London's church. One thing that does link most of the accounts outlined through is that they were written in the 1800s. Specifically, they were written during the Victorian era, where people began to have more heightened interests in history. For the first time, many people had some disposable income, and they would go and visit castles and other historical sites across Britain to immerse themselves in the stories of the Tudor period. For example, the Tower of London at the time began to charge an admission fee to rake in some of this disposable income for themselves, but from the Victorian period a number of embellishments have come to fruition regarding history. For example, Margaret Pole's execution, it was claimed, was made much worse than it was, despite being botched the first time by Victorians, who wished to make the history seem bloodier than it was. But it shows us that Anne Boleyn was captivating people during the Victorian time. But what was the truth to the story? Is Anne Boleyn buried at Saul Church, or is she actually interred inside the Tower of London? We must consider the evidence put forward by Dr. Frederick Mount, the Professor of Medicine to Queen Victoria, who examined the remains of these interred from the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. He said of Anne Boleyn's identified remains that they belonged to a female of between 25 and 30 years of age, of a delicate frame of body, and who had been slender and perfect of proportion. The forehead and lower jaw were small and well formed. The vertebrae were particularly small, especially one joint which was next to the skull, bearing witness to the Queen's little neck. The bones found are certainly those of a female in the prime of her life, all perfectly consolidated and symmetrical, and belong to the same person. The bones of the head indicate a well-formed round skull, with an intellectual forehead, straight orbital ridge, large eyes, oval face, and a rather square full chin. The remains of the vertebrae and the bones of the lower limbs indicate a well-formed woman of middle height, with a short and slender neck. The ribs show depth and roundness of chest. The hands and feet bones indicate delicate and well-shaped hands and feet, with tapering fingers and a narrow foot. He believed that the remains were definitely of Anne Boleyn, and it was said that Anne had been buried next to her brother George Boleyn, but his remains were not found initially during these excavations. What is interesting is that this is a story which will probably never be finally settled. There have been requests at Saul Church for an archaeological investigation to occur to put the rumours to bed, but this is said will always be declined if it arises again. Also, the Crown will never allow an excavation or work of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the Tower of London. The only way to solve the myth would be to obtain DNA evidence, but this will never happen. Because of this, the story of Anne Boleyn and her true burial site remains up for debate. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.